She threw the telegram onto the station floor and pressed both hands flat against the cold wooden wall to keep herself from falling. Not because the news was unexpected, because it was the last thing she had left, and now it was gone too. Evelyn Carter had 17 cents a carpetbag with a broken latch and a Cook's advertisement torn from the back of a Helena newspaper. Cedar Ridge Ranch, Montana. Cook required. Must endure difficult conditions. She picked up the telegram, folded it once, and dropped it in the trash bin. Then she bought a one-way ticket north. If you've ever had to choose between a hard road and no road at all, you already know exactly why she did it. Stay with this story until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now because we tell stories here that don't let go. The wagon driver didn't speak for the last 2 hours of the journey, and Evelyn decided that was probably fair warning. She had been watching the land change since they left town, the grass thinner, the sky wider, the silence growing in layers the way cold does when it comes down from mountains that don't care whether you're ready for them. By the time Cedar Ridge Ranch appeared against the tree line, the afternoon light had gone flat and gray, and the wind had found a particular pitch that sounded less like weather and more like the land clearing its throat. "This is it," the driver said. He didn't climb down to help her with her bag. Evelyn stepped off the wagon without asking him to and stood in the dirt road and looked at the place that was going to save her life or finish the job of destroying it. Either way, she'd made her choice at the Helena station, and she wasn't the kind of woman who unmade choices once she'd made them. The ranch house was large and functional and utterly without warmth. Someone had built it to endure, not to welcome. The fence along the front needed 2 posts replaced. The barn door on the left side hung at an angle that would catch badly in a hard wind. There were 4 horses visible in the near paddock, and the smell of cattle somewhere behind the main structure, and wood smoke coming from one chimney only, which meant whoever was inside was heating one room and letting the rest go cold. She had barely taken 3 steps toward the front door when it opened. Garrett Hayes stood in the doorway, holding a rifle. Not raised, not aimed, just held barrel-angled toward the ground the way a man holds something he has carried so long he no longer thinks about it. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a very long time. His eyes moved across her the way a man's eyes move when he's calculating weight and cost and probability, not when he's looking at a person. "You're the cook?" he said. "I'm Evelyn Carter," she said. "Yes." He looked at the carpetbag in her hand. He looked at the wagon driver who had already turned the horses around and was heading back toward town at a pace that suggested he had somewhere better to be. Then he looked at Evelyn again, and something behind his eyes went flat in a way she recognized the particular flatness of a man who had expected a problem and had just confirmed it. "Ad said experienced cook," he said. "You look like you're 20 years old." "I'm 23, she said, "and I've been cooking professionally since I was 16. Before that, I cooked for a household of 9 starting at 13. I can give you references from the Caldwell Hotel in Billings and from the Hartley family in Bozeman if you require them, though. I'd note that the ad didn't specify references, and I traveled a considerable distance based on what was written." He said nothing for a moment. The wind moved between them. "You got a problem with hard work?" he asked. "No." "You got a problem with cold?" "I have a problem with hunger," she said, "which is why I cook. The cold I manage." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, she wouldn't have called it warmth. More like the recalibration of a man who had set his expectations at one level and found himself facing something that didn't quite fit the category. He stepped back from the doorway. "Kitchen's through the main room and left," he said. "Breakfast is expected at 5. Men eat before they work, not after. You'll find the supplies in the larder, and whatever's missing, you make a list, and I'll arrange it on the next supply run. You sleep in the room at the end of the East Hall. Don't go into the room across from yours. Any questions?" "What do you want for supper tonight?" she asked. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look anything close to caught off guard. "Whatever you can make," he said. I can make a great many things, she said. I'm asking what you want. He looked at her for a long moment. Something hot, he said finally. We haven't had anything hot in 4 days. She nodded once and walked past him into the house. The kitchen was a catastrophe. Not dirty exactly. Someone had made intermittent attempts at order, and the floor had been swept within the last week. But the organization was the organization of people who had been surviving rather than living, which meant things were where they'd been dropped rather than where they belonged. The fire in the stove had been built wrong and was burning hot on one side and barely warm on the other. The flour barrel had been left open and had drawn moisture from the air, and there was a cast iron pan in the corner that had been improperly cleaned and was halfway to rusted. Evelyn set her carpet bag down beside the door, rolled up her sleeves and started. She rebuilt the fire first. You couldn't cook anything worth eating on a fire built wrong, and a fire built right was the foundation of everything else. It told her what the stove was capable of, how the heat distributed, where the hot spots were, and where they weren't. She worked quietly and methodically, feeding the wood in the correct configuration, adjusting the damper, waiting for the temperature to even out. Then she assessed what she had. Salt pork, dried beans that had been soaked and then abandoned sitting in water that had gone slightly off, potatoes that needed using before they went soft, onions, a good quantity of cornmeal, some dried herbs that had lost most of their potency but would still give flavor if she used enough, coffee beans that hadn't been ground, a small quantity of lard that was still good. She worked. She didn't think about Helena. She didn't think about the telegram. She didn't think about the look on Garrett Hayes' face when he'd seen her climb off that wagon, the look that said she was already a problem he was going to have to solve. She thought about heat and salt and timing, and the particular alchemy of turning rough ingredients into something that made a person feel for the length of a meal that the world was not entirely against them. When the first ranch hand came through the kitchen door an hour later, he stopped so abruptly that the man behind him walked into his back. "Lord Almighty," the first man said. He was young, 19, maybe 20, with sunburned cheeks and honest eyes, and the look of someone who had been eating badly for long enough that the smell of a real meal hit him somewhere below thought. Is that beans and pork with onion and cornbread?" Evelyn said without looking up from the pan. "It'll be ready in 20 minutes. Who are you?" "Tom," he said. He seemed to have forgotten the collision behind him. "Tom Briggs. I work the south pasture mostly." "Tom Briggs," she said. "Is there a table in this house large enough for all the hands to eat together? Or does everyone take their food separately?" "There's a table in the main room," said the second man, coming around Tom's shoulder. He was older, 40 or so, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost architectural. "Name's Walt. I run the North Crew. We've been eating in shifts, but there's been no reason to eat together lately." "There will be now," Evelyn said. 20 minutes. Tell everyone." Walt looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then he nodded once and disappeared. Garrett Hayes came in from outside when the food was on the table, and he stopped in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, the same way Tom had stopped with that particular arrested quality of a man whose body has responded to something before his mind has had a chance to put up defenses. He was covered in dust from whatever he'd been doing, and his jaw was set in the habitual way it seemed to always be set, and he looked at the table at the men already seated at the bowls of beans and the sliced salt pork and the cornbread on the wooden board. And then he looked at Evelyn. "Sit down," she said. "It'll get cold." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has a texture to it. She could feel him deciding something. She kept her back to him and ladled the last of the beans into the serving bowl and carried it to the table and set it down and pulled out the chair at the near end and sat down herself. After a moment she heard his boots cross the floor. He sat at the head of the table. Nobody spoke much during the meal. But the quality of the silence was entirely different from the silence she'd arrived into. That silence had been empty, a hollow thing, the silence of people who had stopped expecting anything. This silence was full. It was the silence of people eating with attention of food that was asking to be respected of men who had been running on endurance alone and had just been reminded that endurance didn't have to be the whole of it. Tom Briggs ate 3 bowls of beans. When he finished the last one, he looked up at Evelyn with an expression that was almost embarrassingly open. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't mean any offense, but that is the best thing I have eaten since my mother's kitchen." "None taken," she said. "I'll need a list tomorrow morning of any food restrictions among the crew. Allergies, foods that cause trouble, things that are genuinely disliked rather than merely unfamiliar. I cook for the people eating, not for my own preferences." There was a pause. "Nobody's ever asked us that before," said one of the other men. She didn't know his name yet, a quiet man near the window who'd been watching her with careful measuring eyes since she sat down. "I'm asking now," she said. She felt Garrett Hayes looking at her from the head of the table. She didn't look back. The next morning she was up at 4:30. The kitchen was cold at that hour, colder than she'd expected. The stove had banked down overnight, and the temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and her breath came in small visible clouds while she rebuilt the fire. She worked quickly with the efficient economy of someone who has done cold morning kitchen work enough times that the body does it before the mind has fully arrived. By 5 o'clock, she had coffee on oatmeal with dried fruit and molasses and a pan of eggs that one of the men she'd learned his name was Pete. He was quiet and careful and seemed to take note of everything. Had told her came from 6 hens in the coop behind the barn. She'd scrambled them with a little of the salt pork fat and what remained of the onions and a pinch of the dried herbs, and the result was better than it had any right to be. The men came in at 5 like they'd been told there was something worth coming in for. Garrett Hayes came in last, and he stopped again in the doorway. She had begun to notice that this was a pattern with him, that stillness before entry, that moment of assessment. She wondered if he did it with everything or only with her. "Coffee's on the left," she said without turning around. "Oatmeal's in the pot. Eggs on the platter. I'll have bread tomorrow morning if someone can tell me whether there's yeast in this house or whether I need to put it on the list." "There's yeast," said Walt from his place at the table. "In the back of the lower larder shelf. Been there a while, though." "I'll test it this evening," she said. "If it's dead, I'll add it to the list." She heard the sound of Garrett pouring his coffee. She heard the sound of him setting the pot back on the stove. She heard the sound of his chair at the head of the table. "You were up before 4, he said. It wasn't a question. She turned around to look at him for the first time that morning. "Yes," she said. "Ad said 5 o'clock breakfast. Food doesn't cook itself," she said. "I need an hour at minimum for a proper breakfast. If you'd prefer I start the fire and come back at 5 and serve coffee and cold leftover cornbread, I can do that instead." The men around the table were very carefully not looking at either of them. Garrett held her gaze for a moment. His coffee cup was halfway to his mouth, and he stopped it there. "This is fine," he said. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. She heard Tom Briggs let out a breath he'd been holding. She kept her face neutral. The trouble came on the 4th day. She'd expected it earlier. Honestly, she'd been watching the shape of it since she arrived, the way you watch weather forming on a distant ridge, knowing it's coming, and simply waiting to see what form it takes when it gets to you. The ranch had a particular social architecture, and she'd been mapping it in the quiet hours between meals, who deferred to whom, who spoke first, who watched the door when Garrett came in, who relaxed when he left. Walt ran the crew with quiet competence and genuine care. Tom was the youngest and the most openly trusting. The quiet man by the window, she'd learned his name was Dale. Watched everything and said very little, and she'd decided in the first day that she either needed to be careful around him or rely on him, and she hadn't determined which yet. The trouble came in the form of a man named Cass. She hadn't met him in the first 3 days because he'd been out with the Far Fence crew, and when he came in on the 4th evening, dusty and tired, and clearly someone who held his own discomfort at a very high personal value, as if suffering made him more real. He walked into the kitchen while she was preparing supper and stood in the middle of the floor and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has already decided to dislike something and is looking for language to justify it. "You're the cook," he said. Same words Garrett had used, different weight behind them. "Evelyn Carter," she said. She was chopping onions and she didn't stop. "You're young," he said. "So I've been told. Hayes hire you permanent or just through winter?" "We haven't discussed the specific terms," she said. "I imagine we'll address it when it becomes relevant." He crossed his arms. He was not a small man, broad-weathered, the kind of physical solidity that sometimes makes men believe that the world is negotiating with them. "Women don't last in ranch kitchens," he said. "Not Montana ranch kitchens. We had a woman cook here 3 years back. She lasted 6 weeks." "Why did she leave?" Evelyn asked. He blinked. She got the sense he'd expected her to argue the premise, not interrogate the evidence. "Couldn't handle the work," he said. "Or the welcome," she said, and looked at him directly for the first time. "Would you like to know what's for supper, Mr. Cass?" he said. "Mr. Cass. Supper is beef stew with root vegetables and fresh bread. It'll be ready in 40 minutes. If you'd like to wash up before you eat, the basin is on the porch." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "40 minutes," he said, and left. She went back to the onions. What she didn't say to Cass, what she didn't say to anyone, because it wasn't the kind of thing you said to people you'd known for 4 days in a place where your survival depended on their functional goodwill, was that she knew exactly what kind of situation she was in. She had known it since she got off that wagon. She was a young woman alone in a remote ranch full of men she didn't know, in the employ of a man who held a rifle when he answered his door and communicated primarily through absence and the occasional complete sentence. She was not naive. She had not arrived naive. She had arrived with her eyes open and her hands already accustomed to doing the work of 2 people in a space that didn't make room for her. And she had long since learned that the way you established your place in a situation like this was not by asserting your right to be there, that only made targets of you, but by making yourself so consistently, practically indispensable, that removing you became a problem no one wanted to solve. The bread was the turning point. She'd tested the yeast on that first evening, found it still viable, and spent 2 subsequent mornings building a sourdough starter from the flour and water and wild yeasts in the kitchen air. On the 5th morning, she put the first real bread on the table. A large, round loaf with a crackling crust and a crumb that was soft and yielding and smelled like something that belonged to a home rather than an operation. And the effect on the men was something she hadn't entirely anticipated. Tom Briggs picked up the slice and held it for a moment before eating it, and his face did something complicated. "My grandmother made bread like this," he said. He didn't say it to anyone in particular. Walt cut himself a second piece without comment, but she saw his expression. Even Dale, the quiet one, looked at the bread and then looked at her and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Carter." "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn," he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that felt like a door opening a crack. Garrett ate his bread in silence as he ate everything. But she noticed that he took a second piece, and she noticed that he held it for a moment before eating it the way Tom had, and she noticed that for just an instant his face did that thing. It occasionally did that near imperceptible softening, like light changing briefly behind a cloud, and then it closed again, and he set down the bread and picked up his coffee, and was whatever he always was. She was making a mental list of all the things that needed attention in the kitchen when he came in that evening, long after the supper things were washed and put away, and the fire banked for the night. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the back of a flour sack, and her list was getting long. He stopped in the doorway. He did that. She was beginning to find it almost predictable. "You need something?" she asked without looking up from her list. "Making a list for the supply run," he said. "So am I," she said. "I'll have it ready by morning." He came into the kitchen then, which was unusual. He generally didn't come into the kitchen except at meals, and stood on the other side of the table and looked at her list. She kept writing. "You're listing coffee as a priority," he said. "The men go through more coffee than the current supply accounts for," she said. "They're working harder since they've been eating properly, which means they need more of everything, including coffee. I've also listed salt, more dried beans, another barrel of flour, and lamp oil. The lamp oil is more urgent than it looks on paper. The kitchen lamp is lower than I'd like. and if it goes out before the bread is done rising, it'll drop the temperature and kill the rise." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the men are working harder?" he said. She looked up at him for the first time. "Because they come to the table hungry," she said, "and because they come in talking to each other. Men who are just surviving don't talk at meals. Men who have energy to spare do." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up. She'd been noticing it all afternoon, that particular quality of wind that had something behind it, something building. "There's weather coming," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been smelling it since noon." Something crossed his face. "You can smell weather." "You can't," she said. A pause. "Most women I've known couldn't." "Most women you've known haven't spent 3 winters cooking for a mining camp," she said, and went back to her list. He stood there for another moment. She had the sense he was trying to work out what category she belonged in, and was finding that none of his categories fit. "Supply runs in 2 days," he said finally. "Have your list ready." "It'll be ready by 6 tomorrow morning," she said. He left without saying anything else. She sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the fire settling, and the wind rising outside, and her list growing longer, and she thought about the look on his face when she'd said she could smell weather. Not dismissal. Not the flat recalculation of a man adjusting his assessment downward. Something closer to the opposite. She thought careful. She thought you are here to cook, and to survive the winter, and that is all. She picked up her pencil and added lamp oil again, underlined this time, because some things bore repeating. The wind outside found its pitch in the dark, and she listened to it, and she did not let herself think about anything except the list. The supply list was ready at 5:50 in the morning, folded once, and set beside Garrett's coffee cup before he came down. She knew he'd seen it, because when she came back into the kitchen from the root cellar at 6:15, it was gone. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't expect him to. What she didn't expect was Cass. He came into the kitchen that morning while the other men were still at the table, after most of them had finished and pushed back their chairs and begun the slow migration toward the day's work. He came in and stood at the far end of the table with his second cup of coffee and looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since he arrived, that particular quality of appraisal that wasn't quite hostility, but was something adjacent to it. Something that said she was a variable in an equation he was still working out. "Heard you gave Hayes a supply list," he said. "I did," she said. She was clearing the far end of the table. She kept moving. "Ranch hands put in supply requests through Walt," he said. "Been that way for 6 years." "I'm not a ranch hand," she said. "I run the kitchen. The kitchen has separate supply needs. I assumed Hayes would prefer to know what those needs are directly, rather than filtering them through an intermediary." Cass set his coffee cup down. "You've been here a week." 6 days, she said. "But the principle holds regardless of the duration." "You always talk like that." She looked at him then, square on the way she'd looked at him that first evening. "Like what?" "Like a school teacher," he said. Not kindly. "I was taught by a school teacher," she said. "I took it as a compliment the first time someone said that to me, and I haven't changed my position since." "Was there something you needed, Mr. Cass? Or is this a social call?" His jaw tightened. She saw it happen, saw the moment where he was deciding whether to push further or let it go, and she held his gaze without expression and waited. And after a moment, he picked up his coffee cup and left. Walt was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He had a way of moving quietly for a large man, and she'd started to suspect that the quietness was intentional, not deception, but the particular carefulness of someone who had learned that being present without being obvious was the most effective way to know what was actually happening in a place. "He'll come around," Walt said. "I'm not concerned whether he does," she said, and went back to clearing the table. "You should be," Walt said, and his voice was not unkind. "Cass has been on this ranch longer than anyone except Hayes. He has opinions about how things run." "He can have opinions," she said. "I have a kitchen to run." Walt looked at her for a moment with that measuring expression she'd come to associate with him. "You're not what any of us expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone older," he said. Someone who'd come because they had no other choice. She put the last of the bowls in the wash basin and turned around to face him. "What makes you think I had a choice?" He didn't answer that. But something in his expression shifted, and she saw him recategorize her in some way she couldn't entirely identify. Not with pity, which she wouldn't have tolerated, but with something closer to respect, which she found she could accept. "Cass's wife left him 2 years ago," Walt said quietly. "He came back from a cattle run and she was gone. Nothing broken, nothing stolen. Just gone. He's had a problem with women making decisions on this ranch ever since." Evelyn absorbed this. "That's not my problem to fix," she said. "No," Walt agreed. "But it might be yours to navigate." She thought about that for the rest of the morning. The supply run happened 2 days later, and Garrett came back with everything on her list. Every single item, including the lamp oil she'd underlined. He didn't comment on it, and neither did she. But she noticed it the same way she'd been noticing all the small things, the way he adjusted his schedule to be in the barn during the hour before breakfast. So he wasn't in her way while she worked. The way he'd begun to wait until all the other men had served themselves before he filled his own plate. The way he'd stopped standing in doorways and had started almost imperceptibly coming further into the room. She restocked the larder that afternoon with the methodical pleasure of someone putting things in their proper order. She labeled the shelves. She reorganized the dry goods by category rather than by whenever it was last put down, and she built a small inventory list and tacked it to the inside of the larder door so that she'd know at a glance what needed replenishing before it ran out rather than after. Tom Briggs found her doing this and stood in the larder doorway watching with unconcealed fascination. "That's your labeling everything," he said. "Yes," she said. "In alphabetical order." "By category first, then alphabetical within category," she said. "Grains together, dried legumes together, preserved meats together. It's faster when you're working quickly and don't have time to search. We always just kind of," he gestured vaguely, "put things where there was room." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and watched her work. He was, she'd decided, the most straightforwardly good-natured person on the ranch. Not simple, not naive, but genuinely uncomplicated in his kindness, which was rarer than people tended to assume. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "Where'd you learn to cook like that? The way you cook, it's not just putting food together. There's something different about it." She was quiet for a moment, her hands still moving. "My mother," she said, "until I was 11. After that, I taught myself mostly with whatever I could find written down. And then the mining camp, which taught me how to cook for a large number of people with very limited resources, which is the most useful education I've ever had." "What happened after 11? He said, and then caught himself. "Sorry. That's you don't have to say." "She died," Evelyn said. "It happens." Tom was quiet. "Mine too," he said. 2 years ago. That's why I came out here. Didn't know what else to do with myself." She stopped working for a moment and looked at him. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has said something more true than they intended to. "The work helps," she said. "Not with the missing, but with the mourning. Getting through the morning helps." He looked up at her. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it does." She went back to labeling. He stayed in the doorway a while longer, not talking, and she let him, because sometimes what people need isn't conversation, but the particular comfort of not being alone in a room. The first sign that something was coming. Something bigger than the supply run and the kitchen reorganization, and Cass's simmering resentment came from Dale. Dale, who said almost nothing. Dale, who watched everything. Dale, who came to the kitchen door on the 7th evening after she'd arrived and stood there until she noticed him, which took a moment because she'd been absorbed in calculating the bread timing for the following morning. "Miss Carter," he said. "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn." He paused. She'd noticed the habit of giving his words weight before he put them down, like a man placing stones rather than scattering gravel. You pay attention to how people are doing, not just the food. It's hard to cook for people without noticing them, she said. Hayes doesn't notice, Dale said. He used to. Before Mrs. Hayes died, he noticed. He knew every man's name on the first day, knew their families, asked after sick kids. He stopped. How long ago? She asked. 3 years, Dale said. Fever. It was fast. He built half the North Addition himself the summer after she died. Didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night for 6 months. We all thought... He paused again. We thought eventually he'd come back, but he didn't. Not all the way. Evelyn set down the dish she'd been drying. Why are you telling me this? Dale looked at her with his careful, steady eyes. Because you're changing something, he said. I don't know if you know it, but the men come to meals differently than they did a month ago. There's talk in the evenings again. Tom started whistling when he works, and he hadn't done that since last spring. He paused. And Hayes looked at you yesterday morning. He looks at me regularly, she said. He's assessing whether his investment in a cook is paying off. No, Dale said quietly. This was different. She didn't say anything. I'm not saying it's a problem, Dale said. I'm just saying someone should notice that it's happening, and you strike me as someone who ought to know what's around her. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Dale, she said. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement, and left. She stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time after he was gone. Careful, she told herself again. You are here to cook. You are here to survive the winter. You have 17 cents to your name, and a broken latched carpet bag, and the particular freedom of a person who has nothing left to lose, and you will not complicate this. She picked up the dish and finished drying it. 3 days later, Cass made his move. She'd been anticipating something. The shape of it had been building the way the shape of bad weather builds, accumulating pressure, looking for a weakness in the structure. She'd been watching him the way she watched everything on this ranch now, with the peripheral attention of someone who has learned that the things that matter usually happen at the edge of your vision. He came to Garrett after supper while Evelyn was still in the kitchen finishing the washing up. She could hear them in the main room. Not the words at first, just the register of voices, Cass's with that low, deliberate weight, and Garrett's shorter, clipped. She kept washing. Then Cass's voice rose enough to carry, "Ranch doesn't need a woman making decisions about how it runs." She kept washing. Supply list goes through Walt. It's always gone through Walt, and now she's going direct to you, like she's got authority she hasn't earned. She set down the pan she was washing, not loudly. She set it down quietly and dried her hands and stood still. Garrett's voice, flat and uninflected. She runs the kitchen. The kitchen has its own supply needs. That's not the point. Then what's the point, Cass? A pause. She heard Cass recalibrate. The men are getting comfortable, he said. You've noticed it. They're talking at meals, sitting longer, coming in slower in the morning. She's softening this place up, and that's not what a working ranch needs. Silence. Tom Briggs finished the east fence line 3 days ahead of schedule, Garrett said. His voice was very even. Walt tells me the morning crew has been starting an hour earlier on their own initiative. Dale's been troubleshooting the water system in his own time. You want to tell me again about men getting comfortable? Another pause, longer this time. She's 23 years old, Cass said. She's been here 10 days. She's been here 10 days, Garrett said, and the kitchen hasn't run out of anything. The food is better than it's been in 2 years, and my men are working like they have a reason to. Is there something you actually want to say to me, Cass, or are we done here? Silence. We're done, Cass said, and she heard his boots cross the floor and the front door open and close. She stood in the kitchen with her hands still and the dishwater cooling in the basin, and she kept her face entirely neutral because there was no one in the room to see it, but something in her chest had done something complicated and unwanted, and she needed a moment to put it back where it belonged. She picked up the pan and finished washing it. Garrett came through the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. He stopped in his customary place, that threshold position he always took, and she turned around because there was nothing else to do. "You heard that," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some of it," she said. He looked at her with that expression she'd been learning to read, the one that wasn't flat exactly, but was flat on the surface over something that had more depth beneath it than he wanted visible. "You're not on trial here," he said. In case that wasn't clear. "It was becoming clear," she said. He nodded once. He started to turn. Then he stopped. "The bread this morning," he said without turning back. "It was better than yesterday's." She blinked. She hadn't expected that. "The starter's maturing," she said. "It'll keep improving for another week or two and then level off." He nodded again. He went back through the doorway. She turned back to the basin and stood there for a moment with her hands in the cooling water and her eyes fixed on the wall in front of her. Better than yesterday's. It was such a small thing. Such a profoundly, completely small thing. And she had been alone and surviving for long enough that small things had stopped landing. They just slid off because you couldn't afford to feel them. Because feeling small things cost energy, and energy was survival. But this one had landed, and she felt it land. And she made herself breathe steadily and let it pass. She pulled the plug in the basin and watched the water drain and told herself it was the cold making her eyes sting. The temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight. She felt it when she came downstairs at 4:30, a cold of a different quality than the cold she'd been waking into something with teeth in it, something that meant business. She built the kitchen fire faster than usual, feeding it more wood than she normally would, and while she waited for it to come up, she stood at the window and looked at the sky, which was the particular shade of dark that isn't quite black and has something moving through it at the edges. Walt came in at 5:15, which was early for him, and the look on his face when he came through the door was the look of a man who has been reading Land and Weather for 30 years and has just read something he doesn't like. "How much bread do you have?" he said. No greeting, just that. "2 loaves from yesterday," she said. "I can put 3 more in by noon if I start the dough now." "Do that," he said. "And whatever meat you can get salted and preserved. Whatever can be made ready to cook fast when the stoves are running at capacity." He poured his coffee. His hands were steady, but she saw him look at the window. "How long?" she said. "Could be 2 days," he said. "Could be a week. Up here you don't always get to know until it's on you." She nodded. She went to the larder and started pulling flour. Garrett came down at 5:40, and the moment he came through the door, he looked at Walt, and Walt looked back at him. And the entire conversation happened in about 3 seconds, without a single word, the fluency of 2 people who have been reading the same land for the same years. "I'll get the far cattle in," Garrett said. "I'll take the north crew," Walt said. Garrett looked at Evelyn. She was already measuring flour. "We're going to need the kitchen running through whatever comes," he said. "Can you manage that?" She looked up at him. "I've been cooking in a mining camp through a Rocky Mountain winter," she said. "I can manage." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, she didn't think she'd ever seen him smile, not fully, but something adjacent to it. Something that for just a moment made him look like the person he might have been before whatever had sealed him off from it. "Good," he said, and went back out the door. She turned to her dough and began to work it. And outside the sky did what it had been threatening to do since she'd stood at the window in the dark, and the first real snow of the season came down on Cedar Ridge Ranch like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. The snow didn't come politely. It came the way Montana weather always comes, when it means business, not gradually, not with warning enough to do anything useful about it, but all at once, a wall of white that hit the ranch like something with a personal grievance. By 7 in the morning, the visibility past the barn was gone. By 8, the wind had found a register that made the walls of the ranch house flex and moan in a way that sounded almost human. By 9, Evelyn had 3 loaves in the oven, a 4th batch proving beside the stove, a pot of beans on slow heat, and a growing list in her head of everything that could go wrong. She worked the way she always worked in a crisis, faster, quieter, with the kind of focus that narrows the world down to what's in front of you and leaves no room for anything else. This was a skill she'd learned young, before cooking, before the mining camp, before any of it. When everything around you is coming apart, you find the one thing you can control and you hold on to it with both hands. The kitchen was that thing. She held on to it. Tom came in from outside at 9:30, and the cold that came in with him was a different animal from the cold of the past 2 weeks. He was covered in snow from his hat to his boots, and his face was white around the edges in a way that made her put down what she was doing and cross to him immediately. "Sit," she said. "Right here by the stove. Don't argue." He didn't argue. He sat down heavily on the stool she pulled forward and held his hands toward the heat, and she went to the stove and poured coffee into a mug and wrapped his fingers around it without waiting for him to reach for it. "Where's Garrett?" she said. "Still out," Tom said. His voice had the slightly slurred quality of a man whose face had gone partially numb. "Far pasture. There are cattle that didn't move when Walt's crew pushed them in this morning. He went out with Dale and Cass to bring them." "How long ago?" "Hour and a half, maybe." He drank the coffee in long swallows. Color was coming back to his cheeks, which was good. "Evelyn, it's bad out there. I've been in Montana winters before, but this one came fast. Too fast." "Eat something," she said, and put a piece of bread with salt pork in his other hand. He ate it without looking at it, still staring at the floor, with the expression of a man thinking through what he'd seen. "One of the fence lines on the east side is down," he said. "The wind took 2 posts out clean. We've got cattle that could drift if they find the gap before we do." "Can it be fixed today?" "Not in this," he said. "Not safely." She nodded. She went back to the bread. Her hands kept moving. Pete came in 20 minutes later, then 2 men from the North crew whose names she was still learning. Then Walt, who came through the door with the controlled deliberateness of a man rationing his own alarm, and looked at her across the kitchen with an expression that asked a question he didn't want to ask out loud. "Not back yet," she said before he could speak. Walt pulled off his gloves. "How long has it been since Tom came in?" 25 minutes. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but white. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't have to. "Food's ready when they get back," she said. "Hot water, too. If anyone comes in with frostbite, I need to know immediately warm water, not hot, and don't rub the skin. I need someone to tell me that, back please." Pete looked up from his coffee. "Warm water, not hot," he said. "Don't rub." "Good," she said. Walt poured his own coffee and stood at the window and looked at nothing, and she kept cooking, and the kitchen filled slowly with the men who had made it in, and the warmth from the stove, and the smell of the bread, and the low sound of voices talking in the way men talk when they are frightened and trying not to show it, built into something that was almost like safety, almost like a held breath. The door opened at 11:14. She knew it was them because of the quality of the cold that came in. Deeper, harder the cold of people who had been outside in serious weather for a serious length of time. She heard Walt say something in a low voice, and she heard boots on the floor, and then she turned around and saw that Dale was holding Tom's arm, because Tom wasn't walking right, and Cass was behind them, and Garrett was last, and the look on Garrett's face was not the controlled flatness she'd learned to read. It was something raw, something she hadn't seen on him before. "Dale's hands," Garrett said. His voice was tight. "Left hand 2 fingers." She was already moving. "Sit him there," she said, pointing to the chair closest to the stove. "Tom, I need a basin of water from the kettle, not the boiling one, the one on the left, it's cooler. Bring it here." She crouched in front of Dale as he sat down and took his left hand gently, and he made a sound that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief. And she looked at his fingers. "You can feel this," she said, pressing lightly. "Some," he said. "More than I could 20 minutes ago." "That's good," she said. Tom appeared with the basin, and she took it from him and guided Dale's hand into the water and held it there. "Keep it in the water. Tell me immediately if the feeling starts to intensify. That means it's coming back, which is what we want, but it's going to hurt. All right." Dale said with the restraint of a man who has decided in advance that he is not going to make a fuss regardless of what happens. She stood up and looked at Garrett. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with snow still melting off his coat, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do, moving around the room, taking inventory. Counting the way you count when you've been in something dangerous, and your body isn't done with the adrenaline yet. "Anyone else?" she said. Cass took a knock on the shoulder from a gate post that came loose. Garrett said, "He says it's nothing." "Mr. Cass," she said, turning. Cass was at the table jacket still on his right hand pressed carefully against his left shoulder in the specific way that means it hurts more than you're saying. "Take the jacket off, please." "It's fine," he said. "Mr. Cass," she said again, exactly the same way. No louder, no softer. He looked at her. He looked at Garrett. Garrett said nothing, which was apparently enough because Cass began working his jacket off with the labored movements of someone whose left shoulder has very little functional interest in participating. She crossed to him and helped him with the second sleeve, and he didn't thank her, and she didn't wait for him to. The shoulder was badly bruised, possibly worse. She pressed along the joint carefully, and he went rigid but didn't make a sound. "I don't think it's broken," she said, "but it needs to be wrapped and kept still. Can you do that?" He looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing since the first day, that complex, resistant look, and then something in it shifted. Not warmth, not quite, but the resistance dropped a degree, the way a locked door drops a degree when someone finally finds the key. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." She wrapped his shoulder with strips of cloth she'd had the foresight to keep in the kitchen from the moment she'd identified that this ranch had no adequate medical supplies. While she worked, Garrett sat down at the table for the first time, not at the head where he always sat, but in the middle in the nearest chair. And she understood that this was significant in a way she didn't have time to examine. "The cattle?" Walt asked him. "Got most of them in?" Garrett said. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Lost 3. Maybe more we won't know until we can get out and count." He paused. "The east gap in the fence, the cattle that drifted through it too. We found one we couldn't." The room was quiet. "We'll find her when the weather breaks," Walt said. "Yeah," Garrett said. He didn't sound convinced. Evelyn put food on the table. She put it there in the way she'd been doing for nearly 2 weeks now, without announcement, without ceremony. Just the solid physical presence of prepared food appearing in front of people who needed it. Bread and beans, and the salt pork that she'd been keeping in slow heat for 3 hours, and coffee, and the dried apple preserve she'd found at the back of the larder on the 4th day, and had been saving for when it was needed. Nobody spoke while they ate. The wind outside made the windows shake. Dale made a sound about halfway through the meal, a sharp caught breath sound, and everyone looked at him. "Fingers," he said in a strangled voice. They're coming back." "Good," Evelyn said immediately. "That's good. The pain means the circulation is returning. Keep your hand in the water. It'll ease in a few minutes." He nodded tightly. Tom beside him put a hand briefly on his arm, not saying anything, just the contact, just the presence, and Dale nodded again, and stared at the basin, and breathed through it. Cass watched this from across the table. She caught him watching, and for a moment their eyes met, and whatever was in his expression was something she'd never seen there before. She looked away. She was clearing plates when Garrett spoke. "Evelyn." She turned. He was still at the table, everyone else slowly dispersing toward rest or tasks, and he was looking at her with that expression she'd been learning, the not quite flat one, the one with depth behind it. "Sit down for a minute," he said. It was the first time he'd ever said that to her. She sat. He looked at the table between them for a moment. He had the look of a man who has something to say and is not accustomed to saying it, who has built such efficient systems for not saying things that the mechanism of saying them has grown unfamiliar. "You handled that well," he said. Dale's hands, Cass, keeping the kitchen running. He paused. "I didn't expect—" He stopped. "Didn't expect what?" she said. He looked up at her. "I didn't expect someone who'd know what to do," he said. With the cold injury, with Cass, with all of it. The mining camp had more medical emergencies than I care to count, she said. It's not just that, he said. He seemed to be picking his words with unusual care. It's the, you knew what everyone needed, not just Dale. Tom when he came in half frozen. Walt when he came through the door looking like he was calculating odds he didn't want to calculate. You knew before they said anything. She was quiet for a moment. You learn to read people when you depend on being useful to them, she said. It's not a gift, it's a survival skill. He looked at her steadily. And which one is it for you, a gift or a survival skill? The question landed somewhere she hadn't expected, and she felt the faint familiar alarm of being seen more clearly than was comfortable. She looked at the table. Both, she said. Depending on the day. He was quiet. Outside, the wind had not let up for a single moment in 6 hours, and the house was holding against it, and the kitchen was warm, and she was sitting across a table from a man who was looking at her like she was something he didn't have a category for, which she'd noticed before but had never felt quite this directly. Get some rest when you can, he said finally. We may need the kitchen running through the night. I know, she said. She stood up. I'll rest now for 2 hours. I'll be back down at 8. She was at the doorway when he spoke again. You said it's a survival skill. His voice was quieter. Knowing what people need. She stopped. What do you need? He said. She stood in the doorway for a moment without turning around, and the question sat in the air between them like something physical, like something she could reach out and touch, and she was very aware of her own breathing and the sound of the wind and the weight of 23 years of managing everything alone. Right now, she said, still not turning. 2 hours of sleep, and for that fence line to hold. She heard him exhale something between a breath and something that in another man, in another moment, she might have called a laugh. Fair enough, he said. She went upstairs. She lay down on the narrow bed in the East Hall room, and she stared at the ceiling, and she told herself very firmly and very clearly that what was happening here was a blizzard, and a man who was grateful that his crew wasn't dead, and a kitchen that was holding together under difficult conditions, and that was all. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke at 7:50 to the sound of something she couldn't immediately identify, and then identified silence. Not the silence of the storm stopping. The storm hadn't stopped. She could still hear wind, but a different quality of sound from below. A human silence. The silence of people gathered around something that required quiet. She was downstairs in 3 minutes. The kitchen was full. Every man on the ranch was there, and they were standing around the table where Tom Briggs was sitting with his head down and his hands wrapped around a mug and his shoulders doing the particular thing shoulders do when a person is trying very hard not to come apart in front of other people. She looked at Walt. Walt looked at her and then at the window. Billy Sears, Walt said quietly. Young hand from the bunkhouse. He went out 2 hours ago to check the water line for the north barn. He didn't come back. The room felt like it dropped in temperature. How long since anyone's seen him? She said. 2.5 hours, Garrett said. He was already pulling his coat back on. He hadn't sat down. His jaw was set in the way it got when he had made a decision, and the decision was not a comfortable one. I'm going out. You were out for 3 hours this morning, she said. I know how long I was out, he said. Garrett. It was the first time she'd used his name. She heard herself say it and saw the reaction move through the room subtle like a current, but she didn't take it back. You've been in serious cold for 3 hours today already. Your body temperature recovery time is not. I know my own body, he said. Then you know it's at a disadvantage, she said. Send Walt and Pete. They've been inside all afternoon. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The room was very still. She's right, Walt said quietly from the corner. Garrett held her gaze for another beat. Then he pulled his coat back off and threw it over the chair and said, Walt, Pete, North Barn first, then the waterline path, then widening out from there. Rope between you full length. Don't lose each other. Yes, sir, Pete said, and was already moving. Evelyn went to the stove without being asked and began filling the largest pot with water to heat. Because they would come back Walt and Pete. She was going to make sure that when they did there was warmth waiting for them and for whoever they might be carrying. And she was not going to let herself think about what it would mean if they didn't find him. She moved her hands faster. She kept the fire high. She made herself useful in the only way she knew how, in the way she'd been making herself useful her entire life. And she did not look at Garrett Hayes standing at the window watching the white dark, and she did not think about the sound of his voice when he'd asked her what she needed. She cooked. Outside, Walt and Pete disappeared into the blizzard with a rope between them, and Cedar Ridge Ranch held its breath. They found Billy Sears 40 minutes later. He was alive. Walt came through the door first, and the way he came through it sideways supporting weight told the whole story before anyone could ask. Pete was behind him, and between them was Billy, 18 years old and barely conscious. His weight distributed between the two larger men in the boneless way of someone whose body has stopped making decisions. His lips had gone the particular pale blue that Evelyn had seen once before at the mining camp on a man who had made it back and a man who hadn't, and she knew the difference between those two outcomes came down to the next 20 minutes. "Here," she said, and she was already moving, already directing. "Chair by the stove, not too close. Tom, take his boots off slowly. Don't pull hard. Dale, I need the blankets from the chest in the main room, all of them." Nobody questioned her. That was the thing she noticed in the split second she had to notice anything, that nobody questioned her, not even Cass, who was on his feet with his good arm, doing what she told him before she'd finished saying it. Garrett was beside her. She could feel him there without looking. "His core temperature," she said quietly for him alone. "That's what matters right now. Extremities second. We need to get him warm from the inside out, not the outside in. Hot liquids as soon as he can swallow. Don't put him too close to the stove, or his blood will rush to the skin before his organs are stable." "You've done this before," Garrett said, also quiet, also just for her. "Once," she said. "The other man didn't make it. This one will." She said it like a decision rather than a prediction, and she felt Garrett look at her for a half second before he stepped in to help Tom with Billy's boots. Billy made a sound when the boot came off his right foot. A reflexive, half-conscious sound which meant he was feeling it, which meant the nerves were still talking, which was the thing she'd been holding her breath about. "Good," she said aloud. "That's good, Billy. Stay with us. You hear me?" A movement from him. Not quite a nod. Enough. She had broth ready within 8 minutes. She'd put a pot on the moment Walt came through the door, working off the stock she'd made yesterday from the beef bones she'd found in the cold storage. She brought it to Billy in a tin cup and held it for him because his hands weren't reliable yet, and she tipped it to his lips slowly and said, "Small sips. Don't try to rush it." And he did what she told him with the obedience of someone who is too cold to argue. The room watched. The whole room, every man on the ranch stood or sat in the positions they'd landed in, and watched Billy Sears come back from whatever edge he'd been standing on. And the quality of the silence in that kitchen was the most human thing Evelyn had experienced since she'd come to Cedar Ridge. Tom Briggs was crying. He wasn't making noise about it. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms on his knees, and tears were running down his face, and he wasn't doing anything to stop them. She looked at him and looked away and let him have it, because sometimes that's the right thing, and she knew the difference. After 20 minutes, Billy's color had changed. Not all the way back, but enough. He lifted his own hand to take the cup, and Evelyn let him take it. "There he is," Walt said quietly from somewhere behind her. Billy looked up at her. His eyes were clearer. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was rough and thin, but it was his voice. "Evelyn," she said. He almost smiled. "Evelyn." He looked around the room at all the faces, the whole assembled population of Cedar Ridge Ranch gathered around him in the lamplight. Did everyone?" "Everyone's here," she said. "Drink the rest of that." He drank the rest of that. She became aware of Garrett beside her, only when he handed her a cup of coffee. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't realized how badly she needed it until it was in her hands, and she looked at him, and he was looking at Billy. But he'd handed her the coffee, with the deliberate intention of someone who had noticed, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. The storm didn't break that night. It was worse. If anything, by midnight, the wind had found a new pitch, something lower and more sustained, and the house flexed and groaned under it in a way that kept people awake even when they had no reason to be. Evelyn slept in 2-hour intervals and was back in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with the stove rebuilt and fresh bread going, because she'd calculated that they were going to need feeding at irregular intervals through the night, and she'd rather have food ready than have people going hungry while she caught up. She was alone in the kitchen at 3:15 when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. She knew his footsteps by now, lighter than Walt's, more deliberate than Tom's. Nothing like the dragging shuffle of the night shift men coming off the bunkhouse. She kept her back to the doorway and said, "Coffee's hot," without turning around. She heard him pour it. She heard him pull out a chair not at the head of the table, the same middle chair he'd taken during the storm. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," he said. She put bread on the cutting board and brought it to the table and sat down across from him, which was something she'd been avoiding doing, sitting across from him in the quiet when there was no function for it, no meal to serve, no crisis to manage. She sat down across from him, and he looked at the bread and then at her. "Eat," she said. He ate. They sat in silence for a while, not the empty silence of the first days, that hollow avoiding thing. This was different. This was the silence of two people who have been through something together and are sitting in the aftermath of it. 3 years, he said. Out of nowhere. The way people say things at 3 in the morning that they couldn't say in daylight. She waited. "Since Clara died," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the bread in his hand, at something she couldn't see. "Fever took her in 5 days. I was in Billings for a cattle sale when she first got sick. By the time I got back, she couldn't sit up." He stopped. He seemed to be examining what he'd said, checking it for structural integrity. "I built the North Addition the summer after. Worked 16-hour days for 4 months. Walt thought I was going to work myself to death." "Were you?" she said. He looked up at her. "Maybe," he said. "For a while." She looked at him steadily. She didn't offer him pity, because she understood instinctively that pity was not what he wanted and not what he needed. And because she thought of Dale saying, "He used to notice things, used to know every man's name, used to ask after sick kids." And she thought about what it costs to stop doing that. The particular price of shutting yourself off from everything that can hurt you. "My mother died when I was 11, she said. "I told Tom that. What I didn't tell Tom is that my father sent me to work for a cousin in Butte 6 months after, because he couldn't manage with 4 children and no wife, and he made the arithmetic, and I was the one who could be spared." She paused. "I cooked for that cousin's family for 3 years. Then I was old enough to hire myself out, and I did, and I've been doing it since." He was very still. "You have other family," he said. "A father somewhere in Bozeman who I haven't spoken to in 4 years," she said. 3 younger siblings I write to when I have an address worth writing from." "The telegram," he said suddenly, "at the station. Tom mentioned he said you'd come from the station like someone who'd just had bad news." She hadn't known Tom had said that. She absorbed it, the fact of being observed, of someone having noticed her enough to mention it. "My last position fell through," she said. "The household I was going to was in Helena. 3 days before I was supposed to arrive, the man of the house sent word that his wife had decided they didn't need a cook after all." She picked up her coffee. "I had 17 cents in a broken bag, and no return address to write to, and your advertisement was in the back of a newspaper someone left on the station bench." Silence. "So you came because you had no choice," he said. The same thing Walt had said, the thing she'd deflected. "I came because it was the best option available," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "A choice made under constraint is still a choice. I read your advertisement and I decided this was where I was going. Nobody put me on that wagon." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have gone somewhere else. Another city, another position." "I could have," she said. "The wage you offered was better than most, and the work description was honest about being hard, which I've found means the person writing it has some integrity. People who lie in advertisements about conditions tend to lie about other things too. Something moved across his face. "I didn't think anyone would come," he said. "I put that ad in 4 papers. You were the only response." She blinked. She hadn't known that. The honest description of difficult conditions, she said, works in both directions. He looked at her, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do. He laughed. It was short and quiet and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a long time. But it was real, and it changed his face entirely. Opened something in it, let the air in, and she felt it hit her, somewhere below her ribs, and told herself firmly that it was the 3 in the morning and the storm and the residual adrenaline from Billy, and none of this counted. Then he stopped laughing and looked at her, and the expression that replaced it was something more serious, something that she felt the weight of. "Why haven't you asked about the room?" he said. She stilled. "Which room?" "The one across from yours," he said. "The one I told you not to go into." She met his gaze. "Because you told me not to," she said. "And it's your house. Everyone else has asked," he said. "Every hand who's ever lived in this house, every person who's come through. You haven't asked once." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. He put his hands flat on the table, the same way he'd done after coming in from the storm, and looked at them. "It was Clara's room," he said. "Her sewing room. Her things are still in it. I haven't—" He stopped. "I've opened the door twice in 3 years. Once by accident, once on purpose, and I shut it again after about 30 seconds. She didn't say anything. She understood with absolute clarity that this was not a moment for words. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he said. "It's 3 in the morning," she said. "And you haven't told anyone in 3 years." He looked up at her. "How do you know that?" "Because Dale told me you stopped talking," she said. "And because I've been here almost 3 weeks, and I've watched you, and you don't tell people things. You manage things. You direct things. You provide for things. But you don't tell people things." His jaw worked. "And you do." "No," she said honestly. "I don't either, but apparently 3 in the morning is different for both of us." He held her gaze for a moment that went on long enough to have a weight to it. Then he looked back at the table. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "Clara, she had—" He seemed to search for it. No patience for people who danced around things. She said what she meant. "It drove me insane, and I loved it, and I haven't—" He stopped hard. Evelyn sat with the unfinished sentence and didn't try to finish it for him. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. He nodded once. The nod of a man receiving something he doesn't know how to hold, but is trying to hold anyway. The storm outside found a new level of fury in the small hours, a gust that rattled the windows hard enough to make them both look up. The lamp on the table swayed. "Settled. The east fence line," Garrett said, coming back to himself, to the practical. She understood this too, the retreat into the functional when the personal becomes too much to hold. "If this wind keeps up, we're going to lose more posts. I need to get out there first thing when there's enough light to see." "You need to eat a real breakfast first," she said. "And sleep at least 2 more hours. You're not useful to anyone frozen." He looked at her with an expression that was caught between something she might have called affection and something she definitely would have called exasperation. "You give orders easily for a cook." "I give practical advice easily," she corrected. "You're free to ignore it. And if I do, then you'll make worse decisions than you would have if you'd slept," she said. "And you know it." A pause. Then, 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, she agreed. He stood up. He picked up his cup and his plate, and he brought them to the basin, which no one had ever done before, not once. Not a single man in this house had ever brought his own dishes to the basin, and he rinsed the cup and set it down, and she stood very still by the stove, and kept her face completely carefully neutral. He went to the doorway. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For Billy. For tonight. For—" He gestured a small, uncharacteristic gesture that seemed to include the kitchen and the table and the past 3 weeks all at once. All of it. "Get some sleep," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone in the middle of the storm, and she pressed both palms flat against the warm surface of the stove, and she breathed. He had laughed. He had told her about Clara. He had brought his own dishes to the basin. He had said thank you with that gesture that meant everything. And she was 23 years old with 17 cents to her name, and she was standing in a ranch kitchen in a Montana blizzard, feeling something she had absolutely no business feeling. She pulled her hands off the stove. She went back to the bread. The storm was still going. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and that was the one thing she could trust absolutely. The one thing that had never let her down. That there was always work, and work did not require her to feel anything except the intention to do it well. She worked. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of Cedar Ridge Ranch, and the walls held, and the kitchen light stayed on. And in the morning, there would be more to do than she could calculate. But right now, there was just the bread and the fire, and the sound of a house holding itself together in the dark. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that felt like enough. The storm broke on the third day, not gently. Montana weather didn't do anything gently. It broke the way it had arrived all at once, the wind dropping between 1 hour and the next, the snow thinning and then stopping. The sky cracking open in the west with the particular cold clarity of winter light after a serious storm. Evelyn heard the change in the quality of the silence before she saw anything through the window, the way you hear a held breath release. She'd been awake for most of the third night, not from emergency. Billy Sears was recovering steadily. Dale's fingers had come through without permanent damage. Cass's shoulder was badly bruised but intact, but from the accumulated arithmetic of 72 hours of feeding people through a crisis of managing heat and supplies, and the particular human need for warmth that is not only about temperature. She was tired in a way that went past her muscles and into something deeper, a bone-level exhaustion that she'd learned to work through because stopping had never in her experience been something the situation permitted. When the men went out to assess the damage that first clear morning, she stayed in the kitchen and took stock. The larder was lower than she liked. Not dangerous, but lower. They'd burned through the preserved meats faster than she'd planned, and the flour situation was going to require careful management until the next supply run. She was making calculations in her head, building menus around what remained, when Tom came back through the door, with snow still on his boots, and a look on his face that was caught between relief and something else she couldn't immediately read. "How bad?" she said. "2 fence lines down," he said. "Lost 4 cattle total, found the missing one from the East Gap. She's in bad shape, but alive. The water line to the north barn froze through and cracked. And—" He stopped. "And what?" she said. "The roof on the old bunkhouse lost 3 sections," he said. "The east end is open to the sky." She set down the spoon she was holding. "How many men sleep in the east end?" 4, he said. "Including Billy. They'll sleep in the main house until it's repaired," she said. Tom blinked. "That's Hayes would have to agree to that." "Then go ask him," she said, and picked the spoon back up. Tom went. She heard him 20 minutes later telling Dale that Hayes had said yes without any discussion at all, and she heard the surprise in Tom's voice, and she kept her face directed at the pot in front of her and said nothing. The next 2 days were a different kind of work, the post-storm work, the damage assessment and repair and rebuilding that requires a different temperament than crisis work, more deliberate, more steady. The men were tired. She could see it in the way they moved, the way they sat at meals. The particular heaviness of people who have been running on adrenaline and have now arrived at the other side of it. She fed them accordingly. Not the fast, high-calorie crisis food of the blizzard, the stew and bread and beans that had gotten everyone through. She made things that took longer. A proper roasted chicken with the 3 birds from the coop that were past laying. A slow-cooked pot of dried apple and spiced pork that filled the house with a smell she'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when people needed to be reminded that hardship has an end, and that the end feels like something. Cass came into the kitchen on the second post-storm afternoon and stood at the door in a way that was entirely different from every other time he'd stood at that door. He didn't cross his arms. He didn't lead with the particular set of his jaw that meant he was preparing a position. "Smells good," he said, just that. "Dinner's at 6, she said. "Same as always." He nodded. He started to leave. Then he stopped with his hand on the doorframe and didn't turn around. "I gave you a hard time," he said, "when you first came." "Yes," she said. "You didn't fold." "No," she said. "Clara Mrs. Hayes, she didn't fold either." He paused. "I'm not saying that's the same thing. I'm just saying I recognize it when I see it." He left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen with the wooden spoon in her hand and the smell of apple and pork around her. And she thought about what it means to be recognized by someone who initially refused to see you. And she thought that it might be one of the stranger and more valuable things that could happen to a person. Garrett found her that evening after supper, after the men had dispersed, and the kitchen was clean, and this time he didn't stop in the doorway. He came in and sat at the table in the middle chair, and watched her finish wiping down the stove with the directness of a man who has made a decision and has come to enact it. "Sit down," he said. "I've heard that before," she said, but she sat. He had something in his hands. She hadn't noticed it when he came in, but now she saw it, a folded piece of paper held with the care of something that has been handled many times. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about a week," he said. "So I'm just going to say it, and you can tell me what you think." "All right," she said. "You came here on a one-way ticket because you had no other option," he said. "And you've spent 6 weeks turning this place into something it hasn't been in 3 years, maybe longer." He paused. "The men work differently. The house feels different. Billy Sears is alive because of you. Dale still has all his fingers because of you. The supply system works. The kitchen works. Everything that touches what you do works, and everything it touches after that works too." She kept her face neutral. She was very practiced at keeping her face neutral. "What I'm trying to say," he said, "is that you have done more for this ranch in 6 weeks than I have managed in 3 years of running it by myself, and I have been a fool about it." "You haven't been a fool," she said. "I told you not to go into a room in my own house," he said. "I hired a cook and spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what category you belonged in, because you didn't fit any category I had prepared. I stood in doorways." He said it with a self-awareness that was almost painful to witness. "I have been the least welcoming employer in the state of Montana, and you have—" He stopped. "I've done my job," she said. "No," he said. "You've done considerably more than your job, and you know it and I know it, and I'm sitting here at 8 o'clock in the evening trying to figure out how to ask you something without it sounding like what it might sound like." Her heart was doing something she was not going to acknowledge. "Ask it," she said. He unfolded the paper. He set it on the table between them and turned it so she could read it. It was a revised employment contract. She could see that immediately, the formal structure of it, the terms laid out in his careful, angular handwriting. But it wasn't just a contract. As she read it, she felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. He was offering her a partnership stake in Cedar Ridge Ranch. Not wages. A stake. A legal share. Modest but real in the ranch and its operation. With a separate clause about shared decision-making on household and supply management that effectively formalized what had already been happening for 6 weeks. She looked up from the paper. "This isn't a cook's contract," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "Garrett, I know what it looks like," he said. "I know how it sounds. This is not—" He stopped and restarted with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed and found that rehearsal doesn't survive contact with the actual moment. "I'm not asking you to be something you don't want to be. I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation or because you have 17 cents and nowhere else to go. I'm asking because this place needs you in a way that goes past cooking, and because I think—" He stopped again. "What do you think?" she said. He looked at her directly. "I think you need a place that needs you back," he said. "Not as labor, as yourself." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had sat in since arriving at Cedar Ridge Ranch, and she had sat in some significant silences. She looked at the contract. She looked at his hands flat on the table, the same position they always went to when he was holding himself still against something. She looked at the wall beyond his shoulder for a moment because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't his face. 3 years of building herself into something self-sufficient. 3 years of learning not to need anything she couldn't provide for herself, because need was vulnerability, and vulnerability was the gap where loss came in. 11 years old in her cousin's kitchen in Butte, with a mother's absence that nobody in that house acknowledged, because grief was not a thing you put on the table in front of other people. 17 cents at a train station with a one-way ticket, and a choice that was a choice even under constraint. She looked back at him. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his posture shifted, a release of tension she hadn't known he was holding. "Tell me," he said. "The men get a fair wage increase," she said. "What they're being paid now is what men get paid at ranches that don't feed them well or treat them decently. This ranch does both. The wage should reflect it." He nodded. "The bunkhouse roof gets repaired before any other non-essential construction," she said. "Billy Sears is 18 years old, and he nearly died in a storm partly because the building he slept in wasn't sound. That doesn't happen again." "Agreed," he said. "Supply decisions go through me without requiring your sign-off for standard kitchen and household items," she said. "I'll account for everything, but I don't need approval for flour and lamp oil." "Done," he said. She paused. "And the room," she said. He went very still. I'm not asking you to open it," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I'm asking that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you don't do it alone." She held his gaze. "That's all." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought she'd misjudged, gone too far, reached into something he wasn't willing to have reached into. Then he said very quietly, "All right." She picked up the contract and read it again, fully every line. He waited. He didn't try to fill the silence or hurry her, and she noted this with the part of her brain that was always noting things about him, cataloging the ways he showed himself in action rather than words. She set it down. "I need a pen," she said. He produced one from his shirt pocket. She took it and signed her name at the bottom of the contract, Evelyn Ruth Carter, in the handwriting her schoolteacher had praised and her cousin had never noticed, and the Caldwell Hotel had put on a placard beside the dining room door, and set the pen down. He signed beneath her name. They looked at the signed paper between them, and then they looked at each other, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then Tom Briggs walked through the kitchen door with his empty coffee cup and stopped dead. He looked at the paper. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Garrett. He looked back at Evelyn. "Did something just happen?" he said. "Get your coffee, Tom," Garrett said. Tom got his coffee with the exaggerated casualness of someone trying very hard to be invisible. He poured it. He stood at the stove and didn't turn around and said to the wall, "I'm just going to stay here for a minute if that's all right." Evelyn felt something rise in her chest that she recognized after a moment as laughter. She held it down. Barely. Garrett looked at her across the table, with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. That same thing that had happened when he laughed at 3 a.m. that opening, and she thought, this is what he looks like when he's not carrying it alone. The winter deepened, and Cedar Ridge Ranch changed. Not all at once. Nothing real changes all at once. It changed the way the starter bread changed slowly through daily tending, through the accumulation of small, consistent things that build towards something you can't see, until one day you step back and it's there. Walt noticed it first because Walt noticed everything. He came to Evelyn 2 weeks after the contract signing and said in his quiet, deliberate way, "The men know something's different. They don't know exactly what. But the morale is the best I've seen in years." "It's the food," she said. "It's not just the food," he said, and walked away before she could argue. Billy Sears recovered fully. On the day he came back to full work rotation, he stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way out in the morning and looked at Evelyn with 17-year-old sincerity that was almost unbearable in its openness. "I know what you did," he said, "when they brought me in." "You did the work," she said. "You stayed conscious. You told me I would make it," he said, "like you already knew." "I did know," she said. "Drink your coffee before it gets cold." He drank his coffee. He went to work, and she turned back to the stove and thought about what it means to be certain of something when certainty is the only thing available, and whether that was faith or will, or just the particular stubbornness of a person who has learned that someone has to decide the outcome, and it might as well be her. Dale came to her on a Tuesday morning with a question that surprised her. "Would you want to learn the water system?" he said. "The pipes, the routing, how the North Barn line works. I've been the only one who knows it since old Hector retired and—" He paused. "It seems like something you'd want to know." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I would." They spent 3 hours that afternoon with Dale explaining pipe joints and gravity feed and the particular vulnerabilities of the North Barn line in cold weather. And she asked questions that made him nod with the satisfaction of a man whose knowledge is being taken seriously. And she took notes on the back of a flour sack because it was what she had, and she thought about how belonging to a place means knowing how it works. Really works down to the pipes. It was Cass who told her about the spring gathering. Cedar Ridge had held a spring gathering every year for the first 7 years of the ranch's operation. Neighboring ranches families a day of shared work and shared food that had stopped the year Clara died. Cass mentioned it in the kitchen doorway one afternoon, without quite looking at her in the careful way he'd developed since the storm. "Used to be in April," he said, "when the ground was dry enough. Clara organized most of it." "What would it take to start it again?" she said. He looked at her. "Depends on whether Hayes would agree." "Would you back it if I brought it to him?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "Yeah," he said. "I would." She brought it to Garrett that evening, and he sat with it for a long moment, and she watched something work through him, the weight of it, the 3 years of absence, what it meant to bring that back. "Clara planned those gatherings for 2 months, he said, every detail. "I can plan a gathering," Evelyn said. "It doesn't have to be what it was. It can be what it is now." He looked at her with that expression she'd catalogued, and kept the one with depth behind it, the one that wasn't flat. "What is it now?" he said. "A working ranch," she said, "with men who know each other's names, and eat together, and pulled a kid back from a blizzard, because nobody was willing to leave him out there. That's something worth gathering around." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "April," he said. "April," she agreed. The spring gathering happened on a Saturday in the second week of April, when the snow had pulled back far enough to show the first raw green underneath, and the air had that particular quality of cold going to warm that is the best smell in the world if you have earned it through a Montana winter. 4 neighboring ranches came. Families, children. A woman from the Hendricks place who had known Clara and who looked at Evelyn across the yard with an expression that was evaluating and curious and something else, and who came to find her in the kitchen mid-afternoon and said, "You made the bread." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Clara used to make bread like this," the woman said. "Nobody's made it since." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I learned from a different recipe," she said. "But I think some things find their way back." The woman, her name was Ruth, the same as Evelyn's middle name, which seemed like something looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded once. "You're good for this place," she said. "I can see it." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and meant it. She was carrying a pot of coffee out to the yard in the late afternoon when Garrett fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him come up. The yard was full of sound children dogs, the particular loudness of people who have been too quiet for too long, and he walked beside her without taking the pot, which she found she appreciated. And for a moment they just stood there in the middle of all of it. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "You said April." He looked sideways at her. "I said April because you told me to." "You said it because you wanted to," she said. "I just gave you a reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, just for her, I opened the room. She went still. This morning, he said, before everyone arrived. I went in and I opened the curtains and I stood there for, he paused, about 10 minutes, and then I left it with the curtains open. She looked at him. His jaw was set, but not in the old way, not sealed, not the armor of a man holding everything back, set in the way of someone who has done something difficult and is still standing. How was it? She said. Hard, he said. And he seemed to look for the word. Necessary. It was necessary. Yes, she said. You were right, he said, about not doing it alone. You weren't there, but... He stopped. Knowing you were here was the same thing. Does that make sense? She looked at the yard full of people at Tom, laughing with a kid from the Hendricks place at Dale and Cass standing together near the fence in conversation at Walt, watching everything with his steady, careful expression at Billy Sears, who was alive and standing in April sunlight because the winter had happened and they had held. Yes, she said. It makes sense. He turned to face her, then fully the way he did when he was done managing the distance. I want you to stay, he said. Not the contract. That's already signed. I want... He took a breath. I want you to stay because this is your place now. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Because this is yours. She looked at him for a long moment. 23 years old with a middle name that matched a woman who thought some things find their way back. A carpet bag with a broken latch she'd repaired herself on the second week with a piece of wire she'd found in the kitchen drawer. 17 cents that had become a stake in a working ranch in a Montana valley that was showing its first green. A choice made under constraint is still a choice. But this was not constraint. This was the first time in her adult life that she was being asked to stay somewhere, not because she was useful, not because she could be managed or accommodated or employed, but because the place itself had opened around her and made room, and the man in front of her was looking at her the way people look at things they have decided they cannot afford to lose. I'm staying, she said. I decided that about 6 weeks ago. You're just the last to know. Something broke open on his face. That full thing. That real thing. The laugh that had first happened at 3 a.m. and was now happening in daylight in a yard full of people without apology. He reached out and took the coffee pot from her hands, and she let him take it, and they walked back into the gathering together. And Cedar Ridge Ranch held them both, and the spring came on strong and green and unapologetic across the Montana Valley, and the kitchen light burned warm and steady, and every man on that ranch knew, without being told, that something had been found here that could not be bought or inherited or rebuilt from scratch. It had been built the only way such things ever are. Slowly through storms, through bread and hard winters, and 3 a.m. honesty, and the particular courage of 2 people who had lost enough to know what it was worth to stop pretending they needed nothing. Cedar Ridge Ranch was not a job anymore, and it was not a refuge, and it was not a survival arrangement. It was home. Evelyn Carter had arrived with 17 cents and a broken bag and a one-way ticket, and she had stayed because she chose to, and that choice was the most permanent thing she had ever made.